Let us discuss about scope elaboration. We already discussed that in projects, scope is progressively elaborated. Progressive elaboration is one of the characteristics of projects. That means when we start a project, the clarity on the scope is very low, and as the project progresses, the clarity on the scope increases. And when we reach almost the end of the project, we have absolute clarity on the project. So this process, we call it as the progressive elaboration nature of the project. Every project, irrespective of the type of the project, this is applicable. We start a project with a high-level description of the scope, then we collect the detailed requirements and define the scope of the project, and the scope gets approved and baselined. And once that is done, then we get into the high-level design and detailed design and construction and testing and the release of the project. So every project starts with a very high-level description of the scope, and the scope gets elaborated as the project progresses. We have two types of, basically there are two types of projects. One is the EPC projects. EPC stands for Engineering, Procurement and Construction. Elements are there within the project. And we have Engineering and Construction project because the procurement component is very low in those kind of projects. So typical EPC projects are any infrastructure projects are good examples for EPC projects. It could be a metro rail, it could be a flyover, it could be a hospital building, it could be a new airport or the tallest tower in the world, or it could be a high-speed rail. It has a high degree of engineering component, high degree of procurements, and the construction element is also there. The number of stakeholders in the typical EPC projects are very, very high. Typically, there can be an owner, then there will be a project management consultant, then contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, domain consultants. So the number of agencies are or the stakeholders are very high in most of the EPC projects. Then we have the engineering and construction projects where the procurement element is very low. Most of the IT projects falls into this kind of a category because it is most of the chunk of the work is engineering and then construction of the product of the project, and the procurement element is very low here. Examples: IT projects and new product development. Based on the nature of the project, the life cycle of the project can change, hence the scope definition also will change. Now, projects with waterfall model, when we say most of the EPC projects, they follow a waterfall model where the project is compartmentalized into different stages, and at the end of each stage there is a formal acceptance and handover and takeover. In this case, now example is when we start a project, we start with the high level requirements, and as the project progresses we get into the detailed requirements, and then once we have enough confidence on the requirements, then we define the scope and baseline it. So once the scope is baselined, for EPC projects very often the contract is signed when the scope is baselined, and then a detailed design happens. Then we get into construction, testing, and release of the product of the project. So that's how it progresses. We have the high level requirements, then once that is in a matured state, when that some progress is made, we get into detailed requirements collection. Then you baseline the scope, get the approval for the scope. After that, any changes to the scope will have to undergo the change management procedure, and any changes to the scope hereafter will have implication on the schedule and cost. And then we get into the detailed design, then construction phase, testing phase, and release phase. Till recently, both EPC projects and E&C projects both were following Waterfall. Was a very popular model for development for EPC as well as even for EPC projects as well as even for IT projects. Waterfall was holding good, and very often the contract type used in Waterfall model is a fixed price contract. When the scope is defined, the scope along with the WBS and the bill of quantities are given to the contractors or the probable contractors, and they quote against this defined scope and WBS and the bill of quantities. At the same time, now then we have another model, that is Agile or adaptive or rolling wave or moving window model. Here the scope is elaborated throughout the project. There is nothing like baselining the scope. The project starts with a product backlog, which is a very high level description of the features, one-liners that may get into the product. Then we get into the planning for next 30 days cycle, iteration 1, that is next 30 days cycle in detail. Then for the features we are developing in that iteration 1, we define the scope very clearly. That means we'll have a detailed scope in the form of user stories, and then that part of the scope is built into a product increment in the 30 days time. Then we move on to the next iteration. Again, a subset of the product backlog gets elaborated into detailed scope. The scope is baselined and the increment of the product is developed. So initially our focus will be to come out with a product which is a minimum viable product. We may not build all the features. Must-have features alone we try to build during the initial phases, and then during the later sprints we will build the nice-to-have features as well, and the final product is achieved. So this is another way of doing things. This is very effective in generally E&C projects. It is just engineering and construction. The procurement component is very low. The number of stakeholders are very low. Scope is very difficult to define the scope upfront, and the engineering discipline is easy to change things. Typically IT or a new product development, R&D projects, it is just a set of engineers working together. The procurement is very low here. So there are two types. We discussed about waterfall. In waterfall, our objective is to freeze the scope very early in the life cycle, and after that only very often the contract is awarded. Whereas in agile or adaptive or rolling wave or moving window planning, we sign the contract with a high level description of the features, and very often the contract type can be time and material, and then we elaborate the scope incrementally into iteration after iteration after iteration, and we build the increments of the product. Initial focus is on the minimum viable product, and then you deliver the final product. Both are good. And now another trend is hybrid development. We try to mix and match Waterfall with Agile. So if you take a construction project, till the scope definition and the design, till the completion of design, it is possible to implement the best practices of Agile. And once the real construction starts, we may have to follow the waterfall model. So a combination of waterfall as well as Agile can be implemented within the same project. Each phase of the project we can follow either waterfall or Agile. As a general thumb rule, what I will say is, if the engineering discipline allows for change, and if the number of stakeholders is not so many, and it's very difficult to visualize the scope at the beginning, then Agile is better. At the same time, if the engineering discipline doesn't allow for change, and if the number of stakeholders are very high, then it is better to define the scope upfront, get the approvals, and then go with the contractors and then start building it. Otherwise, the rework cost can be much higher. Here are some of the tools for tools and techniques for scope definition. Maybe brainstorming. We can do brainstorming with a group of experts, or a group of people to understand the potential requirements that has to get into the product of the project. We may adopt questionnaires and surveys. Maybe observation and conversation with the stakeholders is another way. Competitors analysis will help us to identify the gaps of the envisaged product with the competing products. Benchmarking, we can always benchmark your existing product with the product which is better, and that gap will become the scope to be developed. And we can always look at the organizational process assets. That means if you have done a similar project in the past, we can always take the scope document and or breakdown structure of that past project which is similar to this project, and then we can use it with minimum customization. We can use it. That will help us to save a lot of time. To conclude, we said that all projects have this progressive elaboration nature. We start with the project with very less information, and as we progress, we gain more and more insight into the project. That is progressive elaboration. Projects can be of two types. One is EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction elements are there. And then there is another set which is just engineering and construction. IT projects fall into engineering and construction, and this infrastructure projects falls into EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction. And we have two predominant styles for building the product. One is a waterfall model, where the project life cycle is compartmentalized, like requirements collection, high-level scope, detailed scope, high-level design, detailed design, coding, testing, and release of the product. And then we have iterative or agile or adaptive or rolling wave planning, where we have a vague set of requirements and we get into iteration one. When we get into iteration one, the requirements we are planning to build in that iteration one are elaborated and the scope is frozen, and we build the increment of the product. Likewise, we move into the subsequent iterations as well. And the tools and techniques used are brainstorming, questionnaires, observation and surveys, observation and conversation, competitors analysis, benchmarking, and organizational process assets. One thing I missed out here is prototyping, because these days we have great prototyping tools available which are not very expensive, and the BIMs are also there. That is the building information modeling. So we can always see 3D, 4D graphs. In a graphical way, we can model the final product, and that is a new or a great technique to define the scope. So we need to add prototypes and rapid prototyping and building information modeling into this list, which I've missed out somehow. Once the scope is defined, the next step is decomposing the scope into a work breakdown structure, which I'll explain in my next video. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, do subscribe. Thank you very much.